Chapter 7. 100 Years.
Jumping the aqueducts, fire hydrants and hazardous smoke alarms on the back of us. But mama, don't cry for me, rap for me, trap for me, live for me, breathe for me, sing for me, honestly guiding me. I can be more than I gotta be, stole from me, lied to me, nation hypocrisy, code on me, driving me wicked. My spirit inspired me like, yeah.
Ours is not the struggle of one day, 1 week, or 1 year. Ours is not the struggle of one judicial appointment or presidential term. Ours is the struggle of a lifetime, or maybe even many lifetimes. And each one of us in every generation must do our part. John Lewis. A couple of months after we received news that the Canadian government was preparing to offer a national apology for its treatment of the No. 2 Black Battalion soldiers, my father received a phone call from Russell Gross, the co-chair of the National Planning Committee. Russell was the director of the Nova Scotia Black Cultural Centre and had been a leading advocate for a national apology to be given for the treatment of the Black Battalion. They were setting up virtual town halls to consult with community members regarding an apology and wanted as many descendants as possible to be involved. My father asked that I join him. To be honest, it didn't take long for me to figure out that there were two competing agendas behind these town halls. Russell Gross opened the proceedings with a humble recognition of the long years it took for us to arrive at this point in history. He spoke of its value for our Black communities and his hope for the healing that would follow. He then invited us to move into virtual breakout groups and provide input on a series of questions related to the nature of the apology and the event itself. This first discussion seemed to be productive. It certainly provided a long overdue forum for descendants to connect to one another, to share our collective experiences of the impact generations of discrimination had upon our communities. Russell announced there would be more virtual gatherings to follow. We left that first meeting feeling hopeful. As the date moved closer, however, the tone of these virtual meetings shifted. Increasingly lower-level military officials began dominating the agenda. It felt like lip service was being given to questions that were already asked of descendants in previous sessions. When this issue was raised, it was explained that they were simply making sure everyone had the opportunity to give their input. This was all well and good, but if they were paying attention, I said, they would have noticed that it was the same group of descendants showing up every time. At this point, we were more concerned with knowing our input was being included in the planning. After being offered assuring words that it was, the proceedings carried on. Well, we were now just weeks away from the scheduled date of the event. Early on in the consultation process, I had made the comment that travel and accommodation should not be the responsibility of the direct descendants. After all, many were scattered across the whole country. At the time, I presumed this had been noted. But as we signed into the last virtual consultation meeting, we still had not received any word about plans to get us there. Halfway through the proceedings, after listening to military officials reporting details about parade routes, reception locations, meal menus, VIP accommodations, and itinerary, I interrupted them. I said, "Sorry, this sounds like a wonderful event you are planning, which I'm sure descendants would love to attend. But at this point, no word has been mentioned at all regarding their travel and accommodation, so what arrangements have you made?" There was a moment of silence across the virtual screens. Then, a woman who had earlier introduced herself as a secretary for the Defense Department opened her mic. I could see by the look on her face that she was equally confused, as if she didn't understand the point of my question. "Well," she replied, "you are on your own to get here and find a place to stay. Maybe check with the Truro tourist site, or you can watch it online. I think plans are underway to have it streamed." I watched her lips continue to move, but my thoughts drowned her out. She had already confirmed what I had feared from the beginning. This was turning out to be simply another performative event on the part of the government. This time it would be my grandfather flash on a brochure or Instagram post to demonstrate how woke our nation is. There was a running joke at this time within circles of social justice activists that our Prime Minister enjoyed handing out apologies like Christmas cards. It was the kind of public spectacle that was easy to deliver and made the average well-intentioned voter feel a little more pleasant about being Canadian. After all, it's nice to be regarded as a progressive nation on the world stage, and Canadians are all about being nice. But this event was not about niceties. This event was supposed to be about justice. And there is nothing comfortable about justice. It's hard work, uncomfortable work. And you can't do justice for those who have been wronged, like it's some charity event. Justice can only be accomplished when it empowers the oppressed. And asking them to pay their own way to receive an apology for the injustice their government inflicted against them was the definition of hypocrisy. I have to confess, it took everything in me not to lose my mind in the middle of that meeting. But the moment the meeting finished, though, I was ready to let them know how I felt. I called my dad, and he assured me his feelings were the same. At first, we weren't sure who we needed to speak with. While we appreciated the good intentions of the planning committee, they clearly were not grasping the bigger picture of what was happening. There was one person who I had come to appreciate through this whole process. His name was Doug Ruck, the son of the late Senator Calvin Ruck. Doug had been informally involved through the proceedings. I knew that he had followed in his father's footsteps as a civil rights professor and lawyer in Nova Scotia, and that he would understand my concerns about the direction things seemed to be going. I was hoping that a man of his reputation might get them to listen to what we had to say. My dad agreed. 2 days after contacting Doug Ruck, I received an email from Russell Gross. He asked if my father and I would be willing to further discuss our concerns with both him and Lieutenant Colonel Barry Pitcher as the co-chairs of the National Planning Committee. In the meantime, he assured me that my concerns would be formally included in their official records that were to be submitted to the Canadian government in the coming weeks. A few days later, we had our meeting with them. They acknowledged important things were being overlooked and needed to be corrected before the event took place. Shortly after our meeting, we received a phone call from the executive of the Minister of Defense. He confirmed that Minister of National Defense, Anita Anand, had received word of our concerns and would address them directly with the committee. It turns out, though, my voice was not the only one getting her attention. I'd been keeping my sister and brother up to date on what was happening. My sister, Lisa, owned a popular cafe in downtown Peterborough at the time, where many members of Trent University faculty often gathered for social meetings. It happened that one faculty member invited Minister Anand to join her for dessert and coffee after presenting a student lecture. My sister saw the chance meeting as an opportunity to convey our family's frustrations over a complimentary dessert. In fairness, Minister Anand was not aware of all that was transpiring and was sympathetic to our cause. As she took great pains to point out in subsequent meetings, she herself was a person from a racialized background. And given her personal passion for inclusion and change, she had taken on her appointment as Minister of Defense to promote reform in the military institution. It was simply another reminder to all of us that real systemic change is a generational process that doesn't happen simply by putting a person of color behind the desk. Elected officials don't last very long, and people entrenched in the system are fully aware of that. Well, soon after this series of interactions with the Minister of Defense, we got word that a retired captain by the name of Kevin Junor had been appointed to oversee the logistics of the event. I got to know Kevin Junor fairly well over the weeks that followed. As a black man who spent his whole career in the military, he had first-hand experience. He had to overcome prejudice while proving himself a capable soldier over many missions. He understood the perspective of the families as well as the mindset of military personnel. With his involvement, things seemed to finally come together. And when the day of the apology arrived, I felt we were finally ready for the moment. On the morning of July 9th, I stood in front of my father in the hotel room, helping him with the final details of his attire. It was a rare moment of intimacy between my father and I as I gently wrapped the tie around his neck. I could feel him shifting his frail shoulders as he tried to fit into his old military blazer. It took a lot for my father to travel to this event. His body was tired. He barely had a moment to rest since we were whisked from the airport to the various functions across Nova Scotia. But as I slipped the last buttons through his shirt and trousers, I could sense his excitement. There was nothing that would keep him from witnessing this moment of a lifetime. I took a step back. "Well, Dad," I said, "you look ready to take on the world." "Let's go then, son." And with that, we set off down to the lobby. As the procession wound its way to the grounds of the cricket field outside the Truro Golf Course, where the soldiers of the Black Battalion had once assembled for their training some 100 years before, the streets were strangely silent. Security was tight, as would be expected for the arrival of the Prime Minister of a country, although the public were not aware of his arrival until the last minute. Even inside the vehicles, both officials and passengers drove along the street without speaking. I think we were a little anxious about how the event would unfold. As we arrived at the grounds, however, all that uncertainty quickly disappeared. The scene emerged before us beneath a brilliant blue sky. Hundreds of people were streaming into the stands erected just for the occasion. Marching bands were striking up tunes, while others proudly paraded along the green fields in uniforms from various units and across generations. Both old and young seemed equally excited to be part of this historic occasion. If I thought this moment was primarily for the benefit of a few descendants, I could see now, no, I could feel how this moment belonged to all of us. When the formal ceremony finally got underway, there was the usual procession of officials to the podium, each offering their own version of what this day meant for them and their constituents, along with their commitment to never see the injustices of the past be repeated on their watch. The most impactful words were shared by Senator Wanda Thomas Bernard. Dr. Bernard is the first African Nova Scotian to hold a tenured track position at Dalhousie University. As a social worker and educator, Bernard has worked tirelessly to promote mental health in rural Black communities and to teach new African Canadians about legislative rights for citizen engagement. If there was a voice that understood the significance of this moment for our generation, it was Senator Bernard. In the following words, she urged us to hold before us the struggle of those we came to honor. She said, "I want you to imagine what life was like for African Nova Scotians in 1915. Anti-Black racism was flourishing here in Nova Scotia, across the country, as it is today. Yes, slavery had been abolished, but anti-Black racism took root. Life on the margins, harsh conditions, inadequate means to provide for their families. Yet, they made a way out of no way. Our ancestors were survivors, and they were loyal Canadians, even though they had a lifetime of second-class citizenship in this country. Imagine. Despite their personal, family, and community struggles, they were also concerned about the global war effort, the First World War. Imagine, they wanted to help. But they were denied the right to fight for their own country. Imagine, they had to fight their country to fight for their country. To fight for our country. To have the right to join the global war effort. Hence, the No. 2 Construction Battalion was formed. Imagine the sacrifice and dedication. Imagine the fear and determination. Imagine the willingness to put your country first, even when that country didn't value or respect you. Her prophetic reminder of what our ancestors endured stirred everyone's spirits. Why people of the African diaspora have endured and thrive throughout centuries of systemic oppression is because at every turn, faced with being extinguished from history, they have not lost the capacity to dig deep and to hold tight to spiritual roots. It was Maya Angelou who said it best, that despite every effort to diminish the soul of Black folk in the desert of oppression, still we rise. And now gathered in the heat of the sun, on the very ground where our ancestors trained for battle, these descendants embodied the hope of a generation past. Our hearts were ready, and the anticipation was mounting. When Prime Minister Trudeau at last was led to the podium, there was a palpable swell of excitement in the audience. And then, with 100 years pressed into one historic moment, came the words we all had waited for. Thank you, everyone, for gathering here in Truro for such an important event, not just in Black history, but in Canadian history. At this there came applause from the crowd and more response of yes and all right. Looking over the crowd, the Prime Minister solemnly said, "You persevered in keeping the memory of Canada's first and only Black battalion alive. We are here to accept responsibility for mistakes of the past and to pledge ourselves to working every day to build a better future. Among the most selfless things a person can do is to stand up and volunteer to fight for their country, to risk your life, to defend your values and your loved ones, is an act of extraordinary bravery, of honor, of sacrifice, of loyalty. When the First World War broke out in Europe and Canada joined the fight, men from across the country flocked to enlist. Among those brave volunteers were hundreds of young black men, eager to serve, who loved Canada and were eager to take up arms to defend king and country. They were willing and able patriots who wanted to serve. The minister paused. Then, in a deliberate tone, he continued. In repeated acts of discrimination and racism, almost every single black volunteer was turned away and denied the honor of serving their country. In one instance, a group of 50 black volunteers journeyed from Sydney to New Glasgow by train and waited all day at the recruiting office, only to be told that this was a white man's war. Those recruiters did not see men willing to fight for our collective freedom. They only saw the color of their skin. The Prime Minister's voice started to rise. This is what systemic racism and anti-black hate does. As he uttered those words, a collective "Amen" filled the air. Voices started rising with prophetic fervor, for they already knew where his speech was going. They had lived through it their whole lives. It suppresses the truth, Trudeau cried, as the crowd echoed his words like a litany. It tries to rewrite history under false narratives. It buries the bravery, humanity, and common cause we share. But human nature shows us, again and again, that people will always find a way to stand up and demand their dignity. This was it. There was nothing to hold back history now. We were in the moment. Never before had words about the black struggle in this nation been articulated so clearly by one holding the power of government. People were rising from their chairs, urging the Prime Minister on through shouts and ululations. Sitting under the canopy, just rows behind my father, I bowed my head in solemn prayer as I waited for the one word we all came to hear. As a country, we failed to recognize their contributions for what they were, their back-breaking work, their sacrifice, their willingness to put their country before their self. The Great War was won at the hands of every soul that served. We owe these men, these brave black men, so much. I am here today to offer the Government of Canada's official apology for the appalling way these patriots were treated. By now, applause thundered through the makeshift arena. With my head still bowed, I could feel the bodies all around me rising from their chairs. The Prime Minister's voice rose unabated above the crowd. For the overt racism of turning black volunteers away when they offered to sacrifice their lives for all, we are sorry. For not letting black service members fight along the white compatriots, for denying members of No. 2 Construction Battalion the care and support they deserved, we are sorry. By now the Prime Minister could barely be heard over the celebration erupting all around him. He pressed on. For failing to honor, commemorate the contributions of the members of the Number 2 Construction Battalion and their descendants, for the blatant anti-black hate and systemic racism that denied these men dignity in life and in death. We are sorry. Again, whistles and shouts filled the air. I could feel the tremor of 1,000 feet tapping the earth. I lifted my head and looked around. Strangers, uniformed soldiers were hugging each other. As I peered to the front, I could see that my father had somehow managed to get out of his chair. Despite his frail legs, he stood tall and stoic. His eyes were covered by his dark glasses, but I was close enough to see the tears that ran down his cheek. I knew what this moment meant for him. And then, thanking the descendants and organizers who persevered in making this moment happen one last time, the Prime Minister strode off the stage to another round of applause. Before he returned to his chair, the Prime Minister paused in front of my father, who happened to be seated right next to the stage. I could see him reaching out to grab a hold of my father's hand. And then the Prime Minister bowed his head. As he leaned closer, I could see the Prime Minister's lips move as he slowly uttered the words, "I'm sorry." My father simply nodded his head. As the Prime Minister turned away, I could see my father's shoulders rise, as if the weight of 100 years had finally been lifted. A few weeks after the National Apology event, we got a call from the producers of W5, the Canadian television documentary program. This poignant moment between my father and the Prime Minister of Canada had been captured on television. They said Sandy Ronaldo, the host of the show, wanted an interview with us to hear our thoughts about that historic day. She flew out west to meet us the following week. After listening to my father reflect on the journey and how he was impacted by the apology, Sandy Ronaldo leaned in and asked him, "As your father's representative today, do you think he would accept that apology and say, 'Yes, that's good enough for me'?" My dad looked intently at Sandy and said, "My father had a tough life. It was tough when I was young, but I grew out of that. Papa, he didn't have a chance to grow out of that. If they, at the time, with my father and those guys, if they said, 'We're going to do something about this,' my father would have simply said, 'Well, hallelujah.'" At this moment, the reality that his father was never afforded a word of dignity or redemption in his lifetime finally sunk into him. He shifted in his seat slightly, but as he continued to speak, tears filled his eyes. Slowly he said, "But for me, to speak for my father now, I won't even try. I won't even try."